Well, I actually first became aware of the Grand Theatre. I was about 13. I was brought up in Bryn Hyfryd, and my dad was a photographer, and he was the resident photographer in the top rank in Swansea. And I used to go there, of course, on a free pass because my dad worked there. And the DJ at the time, Tony Wynne Jones, said to me one day, how would you like to be my assistant doing the teeny bopper sessions on a Saturday morning? Which I did. I started off doing that when I was 13. My name was Nipper Dewitt, as he used to call me. And I was doing that every Saturday morning at age 13. And then one day, a star came along to the Saturday morning session who was appearing in the Grand Theatre. And his name was Barry Hopkins. And he had a couple of songs, a couple of records out. And, oh gosh, what a lovely, lovely man he was. So he'd often perform in the top rank when he was doing things here at the Grand Theatre. And I got to know Barry quite well over the years, and he'd come back, maybe I might have been 17 or 18, and we'd catch up, and he was a keen photographer himself, and he took some publicity photographs of me when I was about 17. So that's my first memory of this place, and the superb person who was Barry Hopkins. So after the Barry era, he was just such a lovely guy. We got on really well, and I got to know him. Actually, at one stage, I actually went to London to see Donna Summer and stayed in his flat with Dave, his partner, and had a great time up there as well. And he did all sorts of photography and did some publicity things for me, because after my top rank days when I was just 13. When I turned 17, then I went as a mobile disco and doing things like that. Ended up in the Townsman as the resident DJ there, and saw lots of bands that were appearing here, and they'd all come up to the Townsman. And it was while I was there, I was also doing hospital radio, and I ended up at Swansea Sound when I was 21. And of course, you can imagine over the years doing the interviews on Swansea Sound with people that were appearing in the Grand. We'd have all sorts of people in. Dorothy Squires was one who came in to the studio, and she also appeared in the Townsman. So when she actually came into the studio, I already knew her, and I'd done a week's cabaret with her, and I got so friendly with Dorothy Squires. We used to talk all the time. She was mad. She used to send me Valentine's cards and things like that. And she did an interview once, and she said, I'm thinking about, making another album, but I don't know if people would want it. And I played some tracks from her previous albums and so on. And we had such a response from the audience that she phoned me up and said, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it thanks to you and your listeners responding to what I was saying in the interview. And she released an album. The day that the album was released, I spoke to Christos in the local record shop behind, in front of here, and I sort of said, Dorothy Squires has got a new album out. Can she come along and do a signing? Yeah, of course she can. Brilliant. So he opened the shop on the day the album was released, and of course, the whole street was blocked off. The queue was going across the road from the shop. It was going down the Picton Arcade, and then it was right beyond that. People were actually looking at the Grand Theatre while they were waiting to go up the arcade to go in. The place was packed, and Chris, the manager of the shop, told me that Dorothy Squires that week outsold Bad, which had just come out after Thriller, and that was the album that everybody was buying, apart from in that shop where it was Dorothy Squires' album was the biggest seller of the week. We became so friendly that when she did actually pass away, I was a bearer at her funeral as well. And look back now through letters and cards and daft things that she would say, and she was just a lovely lady and spent a lot of time here, of course, over the years. So that was Dorothy Squires. Of course, over the years, many other people that were appearing in the Grand. Lorraine Chase is another one. She was appearing in a play here, and I got my pilot's license. And, well, I had to, once I told the people at the Swansea airport that Lorraine Chase was here, they all said, oh, you've got to get her up here, it's not Luton Airport, it's Swansea Airport. And so I brought her up and took her for a fly around one day, and she signed all their photographs, and whoever was in the Grand, I'd be having them on the radio to do interviews. And you'd come and see some of the shows and enjoy the shows here, enjoy the atmosphere. And I ended up actually doing theatre myself, because I had a phone call from Port Talbot Council, or Ogwr Borough Council as it was, asking me if I'd like to be in their pantomime, which I did. And I did the pantomime in Port Call. That was 81, I would have thought. And before I knew it, then the following year, I'm talking to John Chilvers about coming here and doing a panto in the Grand Theatre, and I couldn't believe my luck. I was just so excited, and not only was I excited, but I absolutely loved it. We had Graham Cole, Paul Keown, a lovely cast, and we just had a laugh. Graham, Paul, and myself all shared a dressing room, and it was just fun. Graham and I especially, Graham went on to be a PC stamp in the bill. Graham and I especially would be in the dressing room at the same time at certain stages of the show. And on one part of the panto, Paul Keown was having to sing a solo song as the principal boy. I think it was I Made It Through the Rain. And towards the end of the song, Graham and I would be listening to the speaker, because every dressing room had its own speaker, and we'd be listening to the speaker hoping that Paul would hit the high note at the end of the song, because if he didn't, we'd be sitting there thinking, oh crikey, wait for it. Paul would come back to the dressing room door and he'd either hit the wall with his sword or his belt, whatever it was closest to hand. There would be a smash against the wall, and our dressing room was a porter cabin, because this is the year that the panto was reduced. I think it used to be about 15 weeks, and it reduced to about 11 and a half on this particular year, because they were closing it early in order to do all the renovations, and they were doing a lot of them during the show as well. So our dressing rooms were all porter cabins, but our particular dressing room, Graham, Paul, and myself had a hole in the wall where Paul Keown would actually smash his belt against the wall if he didn't hit the note at the end. But Graham and I, we used to laugh, and we used to wait for it, and we'd be trying not to laugh, but sniggering in the background. And if he caught us sniggering, then he'd laugh along with us as well, But great part of the panto. Also on that show, of course, was Don McLean, who turned out to be just a really great guy. It was my second ever panto. And he'd come up to me, because I was the villain. John Chilvers, gave me the part of the villain, Silas Sly. And it was great, because having somebody like Don McLean, who'd done loads of them, Don from Crackerjack, he would pull me aside when we're doing the rehearsals, and he'd say, right, when you're leaving the stage, don't just walk off, just turn round and go, bah, shut up, you horrible kids, or I'll poison your ice cream in the interval. And he'd give me so many stagecraft tricks that I learnt, and I had the audience hissing at me terribly. So much so, even years later, I'd be walking through town and I'd hear some hissing behind me, and I'd turn around and it would be some kids that had seen me in the pantomime still booing and hissing me when I was walking through town. But Don was a great guy. There's a great story about him on one occasion. We were doing the show, and as part of the show, he'd go off for about 10 minutes while something else was going on, and he'd take his costume off, and then he would have a harness strapped to him for like a high wire part of the act. So they'd put the harness on, and on top of the harness they would put like a Tarzan outfit, covering his whole body, and then he'd actually put a dressing gown over that. He'd come out the front and he'd do a bit of dialogue, and with that the curtain would go up, and then he'd drop the dressing gown off, and he'd be there as Tarzan, and he's flying through the air and the scenery. Except for one day, he actually put the harness on, and then put the dressing gown on, forgot to put the Tarzan outfit on. So he's at the front doing his bit, and what we'd often do is we'd go to the very top level. I can't remember what they call it, the gods. So during the show, if we had like a 10-minute break, 15-minute break, we'd go sneak out to the back and we'd watch it from the gods. And on this particular occasion, he'd forgot to put the Tarzan suit on. So the dressing gown came off, he got lifted in the air, and he's flying through the air in his underpants and a vest. And there are certain parts of it where he's upside down as well, and he's trying to push the vest up to cover the underpants. And the whole cast, the orchestra, we were laughing on the gods, and everybody's wondering who's up there. And it was one of the funniest things that's ever happened to me in my life. And Don, upside down, pulling his top, his vest up to hide his pants, and that was one of the funniest things ever in pantomime. And that was Don McLean in the year that I did it, and never forget that year anyway. It was just fantastic. As well as Don McLean, of course, in this panto were a couple, and they were an absolutely lovely couple, elderly couple, called Keith and Annette, who were the pantomime cow. Now, they were a brilliant cow. They just were perfect at the job. But of course, when you're on stage and you're doing things and you're trying to keep a serious face and you're trying to be the villain and things like that, and you can hear little words coming from inside the cow, which often would corpse you. Freddie Lees often would do that as well, because he would, every time I'd come on, my opening line was, "Stand back, you miserable earth creatures." And I'd sort of say that as dramatic as I could to try and make Graham Cole laugh, or Paul Keown. I'd try and make them laugh, and I'd overact that part. And then Freddie Lees would come back up to me, and he'd say, "Get back, you dirty Gertie from number 30, or he'd have a different line to throw at me every day to try and set me off. But we were just a bunch of mates having a laugh, and although that was our job to make people laugh, we weren't supposed to make each other laugh, but often we did, and that added to the show as well in some respect. It just made it very funny. But Keith and Annette, when you're hearing stories from inside the cow, you didn't know where the voice came from, but you're trying not to laugh. It was great fun. Sadly, because it was a speciality act, you don't see so many of those these days, and we would have had a video of that pantomime because somebody wanted to film it, but they were worried that somebody would copy their act if it was filmed, and another people could have copied their act. But what they did do for me one day was let me borrow the head of the cow. And I was in the radio station the next morning, and I timed it so that I could see on the cameras. I was doing the breakfast show. I could see the engineer. I could see the lights of his car arriving on the cameras in reception. And when that happened, I put a long record on, and I went through the fire door at the back. So as he was unlocking the front door of this radio studio, I put my head round the corner with the cow's head on and went, "Moo!" And he turned round and nearly jumped out of his skin. And that's one of the big stories of Swansea Sound back in the early days. But yeah, the cow, how can you make a cow look brilliant on stage? Keith and Annette, not Keith, but Keith with an F, Kwfe if I remember. They were just very, very good. They'd been doing it for years, and sadly they both passed away not long after that panto. The year before was a great panto here, of course, because while I was in Porthcawl, a radio colleague of mine, Mike Evans, was Ryan's manager, and so I'd often come here after my panto and sort of see the end of that one. And obviously this one ran on a lot longer than my Porthcawl one did, which was about a month. This one went on for about 3 months. So I spent a lot of time here in the background and watching the panto with Ryan and Ronnie and all the people that took part in that one. And the following year, when I was actually Silas Sly, I remember saying to Ryan on one occasion, "How do you make your teeth black?" And he said, "Oh, I've got this tooth paint," he said. You just paint it on your teeth, it dries off, and it looks like you've got teeth missing. So when I was Silas Sly, I had the same thing. But Ryan, at the end of the previous year's panto, at the end of the panto, he actually presented me with his bottle of toothpaste. And the following year, I went to the drama shop and bought a bottle myself. I never used this one that Ryan had given me. I went and bought it myself and would paint his teeth out. And often I'd be in the mirror, painting my teeth out to make them look black, and think about poor old Ryan. At the end of his show, he had a bit of a party just at the end of that run, and then he went off to America, and of course, sadly we lost him. But I often think about him, and I've been here not long ago, actually, for Mike Evans presented a performance as a tribute to Ryan. The place was packed, and even 40 years after he died, this place, it could have been 5 times as large, because it was just totally full of people that remembered and loved Ryan from those days. After my panto then, I went and did another one in Porthcawl, and loved that too. It's just funny that as work situation changed, and I eventually left Swansea Sound and went to work at the BBC in Cardiff on Radio Wales. I did presented an early morning radio show, and I also produced Roy Noble, and then went from radio to television. So that sort of like all fizzled away then. Although I still lived in Swansea, I was commuting back and forward to Cardiff, and couldn't go out so much and do things in the nights here that I used to do before. Talking of the nights, of course, doing the panto took a lot out of me, because I left the top rank when I was about 16, and I went to work in the Townsman. As I said, that's where I met Dorothy Squires and various other people. But eventually then the top rank asked me to come back, and I was 20 years old when I came back. And so I was the DJ in the top rank. I was also the breakfast show presenter on Swansea Sound, doing a radio show. And then I got asked to be in the panto. So I couldn't give up either of the other jobs. So, for instance, when I was rehearsing, I'd do my breakfast show, finish at 9 o'clock. We'd be here rehearsing the panto at 10, and that went on till about sort of like 4 or 5 o'clock every day. I'd have a couple of hours before I went to the top rank and finish there at 1:15 to be back on the radio by 6 o'clock in the morning. So it was it was a lot of work. When the panto was running then, especially on a matinee day, like on a Wednesday, so I'd come off the radio at 10, and I'd be here for about sort of 12 o'clock. We'd do the matinee, we'd have an hour and a half in between them, and more often than not I'd have a little sleep in the dressing room. And then of course the evening performance finished at about 9, which is what time the top rank started. So it would be off with the makeup, and then I'd be on in the top rank then until 1:15, 12 o'clock, depending on what time the function or the evening disco night sessions ended. So it took a lot out of me. It really did. And on many an occasion in the top rank, I'd be on stage for about half an hour. Then the band would do 45 minutes, especially in a function. I'd actually say to the lead singer of the band, "Can you come and give me a shout before the last song?" Because I'd be sleeping in the dressing room. So I'd wake up, wipe the sleep out of my eyes, and then go back on and do another set. And the band would revolve from one side to the other. The stage in the top rank was like the London Palladium. There was like a barrier in the middle where the band were on one side and I was on the other. Sounds ideal, except in those days, before electronics and before digital music, you were playing records, and as soon as the band gave the signal for the engineer to rotate the stage, the record would jump. So you had to sort of get the band to keep playing until they'd virtually got to the other side before I started the record, because if I started the record while the stage was revolving, it was such a rickety, bumpety ride. The records would just jump all the way around. I often think now, in the days of electronic digital music, how great it would have been to be able to just play something off a DVD or just press a digital audio track, because you're trying to keep the momentum going, the people dancing with the band playing, and then the idea is to have a seamless join to me, but more often than not the record would be all over the place. I had to keep putting it back on. But good days, top rank, that's another thing that's not there anymore. Thankfully, the Grand Theatre still is. After the panto era, of course, I was delighted to be coming back and forward to the Grand Theatre. One of the things I loved doing was with an orchestra called the Peripatetics in Primary School Orchestra. They're the people that would be teaching the children how to play musical instruments in schools. And we narrated Snowman. The idea being that we bust children in from all the schools. They'd watch me narrating the Snowman, and also we paid attention. We showed them what instruments were being played and what the trumpet sounds like, and it was to get young children interested in playing a musical instrument. And from what I heard, it went really well. We did it for many, many years, and we did it all around the place. And basically there was like a 12, 15-piece orchestra, and they'd be on the stage and they'd do a lot of orchestral pieces, and then they'd bring me on to talk about all the individual instruments, and then I would narrate the Snowman. And I've got recordings of it, and to this day it sends shivers down my spine when I hear the words, "It was a cold, cold morning in the country, in the middle of the night, a little boy lay sleeping." And I just loved doing that. And we did it here, we did it in Bridgend, in Porthcawl, in Port Talbot, in Neath, Llanelli. We did it all over the place, and we did it for many years. We came back to the Grand very often doing the Snowman, and the reaction from the children and from a lot of adults who said, "Oh, when you produced the scarf in the end, I cried," because it just, when it's live, it's fantastic, and that's one of the reasons why we should always have a theatre. And of course, the thing I remember most about it is the ending, where the little boy sings "Walking in the Air," the boy soprano. He sings "Walking in the Air" and stands next to me. And there's the piece in the story about the scarf that Father Christmas gave the little boy. And as the show ends, the boy wakes up, and the story narration goes that when the boy woke up, he thought it was all a dream, but the scarf that Father Christmas had given him was still around his neck. And then I wrapped the scarf around the little boy's neck, and the orchestra cries, and the teachers cried, and the children were nearly crying as well. It was a very emotional and a lovely ending, and one of the great things to do live. Thoroughly enjoyed doing that at the Grand Theatre. A few years after my panto, I was back here and taking part in a show called The Night of 100 Stars. And there were so many famous people here, all converged. It was something that John Chilvers had actually put together, and I'm sure it was like a testimonial to a great friend of his, Pat Phoenix. And my role in the evening was to introduce some of the artists. There was a few of us that were asked to do that. And Duncan, the stage manager, who was also stage manager at the panto that I did here, he was still doing things here. As I'm walking on to introduce Stan Stennett, he says, "Keep talking until I tell you," because there was a problem with Stan Stennett's piano, because he was doing like a ragtime session with some other members of his band, and they couldn't get the piano to work. So I walked on stage, and I'm thinking, well, how long is this going to take? So I did a bit, and then I thought, what's the longest joke that I know? And I came up with a really long one, which was a very funny joke, but it took ages to tell. And I thought, well, if I start this, they'll be trying to get me off if he's ready to go. But I told that joke and a few more, and they still hadn't solved the problem with the piano. They ended up using a different one, if I remember correctly. It was an electric piano that Stan bought, and eventually I think they just used a piano that had been used for another part of the show. And then I didn't go down very well with Stan when I introduced him, although the audience thought it was funny. I think it was the Gendros Amateur Operatic Society performed a Broadway musical performance. And then Catherine Zeta-Jones came on as well. At the time, she was performing in 42nd Street in the West End. And she brought some of her fellow cast members down and did this performance, which absolutely knocked everybody out. It was stunning. So by the time he came to introduce Stan Stennett, I said on the microphone, well, we've been to Broadway, We've been to the West End and now Porthcawl. Everybody thought that was really funny because Stan's famous for working in Porthcawl and the Panto and so on. But I was told by somebody who was backstage at the time that he wasn't very impressed with me. So apologies, Stan. That was a great night though, and so many people performed here, but so many people performed for longer than they were allocated that the show went on beyond 1 o'clock in the morning. And it was, by the time it had finished, we were all falling asleep. It was a great performance, but it went on a lot longer than expected. So I have so many lovely memories of this wonderful place. And more recently, I've been to see quite a few acts performing here. There's a brilliant Elvis show, and it's called Rocking on Heaven's Door. And they have Buddy Holly, Little Richard, and people performing, all sorts of artists, Bobby V, and all those. But of course, the show ends up with a chap called Richard Atkins, who does an Elvis show, and it is absolutely outstanding. And I've been here many times to see him over the years. I also saw Van Morrison here, as well. I'm quite disappointed, really, to be honest with you, with that show, because I love Van Morrison's music, but he came on the stage, sang all his songs, and many that nobody had ever heard of, and didn't say a word to the audience. He just sang a load of songs and went off. But I've seen many great artists here over the years, including, of course, the Ultimate Classic Rock Show. Saw that act recently, and if ever you get a chance to see them down here or anywhere, go and see them. One of the best bands I've ever seen. Also, another band that sadly no longer together, but I still keep on nagging them to rejoin, is the Stories. I've seen the Stories perform down here a few times as well. They packed the place out, as did the Ultimate Classic Rock Show. They packed the place out, and this is a great venue to see such a great band with such a great view of the stage and what's going on. And that's one thing about this place. You can't beat it, whether it's a show, whether it's a pantomime, whether it's a play, a band, whatever it is. This is just the place to see everything going on. I love it. Thank goodness for the Grand Theatre.